It is indeed showtime. How you
We're
doing, Chad?
live.
Happy Friday, mate. How you doing?
Happy Friday. I'm good. You?
Good, thank you. I think this is either the fourth or fifth of these live streams we've been doing, and they get a reasonable attendance, don't they?
Yeah.
So we're going to carry on doing them until either we get booted off LinkedIn or more people start watching. One of those two things will happen eventually. So this week we're going to talk about a few things, and as a bit of a spoiler, in the middle section of this, we're going to talk about three-body problem, which is what everybody's talking about at the moment, and we've been talking about ourselves.
Yeah.
So we're going to have a talk without trying to actually have any spoilers in that conversation.
Oh, we're gonna no, that's not true.
No,
Don't
we're
lie.
going to
We're gonna spoil the.
Yeah,
If
we'll
you
spoil
haven't
it.
watched the show, either be prepared to have it ruined for you, or because we can't talk about this without spoiling it.
All right, let's
And it's been
spoil
out
it
for a
completely.
month. I mean,
So
if you haven't
let's
watched it
see
by
if we
now,
get loads of viewers for the first 10 minutes, and then
Yeah.
we kill the audience because they're all massive free body fans, but haven't got to the last episode yet, which we both did yesterday.
Yeah.
Right, let's talk about the other stuff first then, because you know we title all these episodes something. The first few episodes were "Dude, Where Is My?" because we didn't have better ideas, and this one is not called, but "Dude, Where Is My Nature Inspired Engineering?" So who did you talk to in this week's episode of the podcast, Chad?
I talked to Dr. Mark Price, who's a professor at Queen's University in Belfast, and he is heading up a very interesting project. And it's full disclaimer, it's going to be hard for me to do justice to the research he does, because it's really, when there's thinking outside the box and then there's thinking outside the box, and this is really that. It's hard to put it in words. He can only, to some extent, eloquently describe what he does, and it's just a very good reason to go listen to the episode. Hopefully I'll do enough justice that you'll be interested to go listen to the full conversation. But basically, he put forward this idea: design, how we approach design, how we approach design, engineering, manufacturing. Is it the best way? Is this really the best we can do? And can nature, the way it works, teach us how to approach that whole process in a better way, in a more holistic way, in a more way that allows us to adapt and change our processes as fast as pretty much the rest of our technological skills and ability are adapting these days and changing these days.
And before I listened to the episode, and I listened to it twice because it's so good.
Thank you.
Genuinely so
Thanks to
good,
Mark,
and
yeah.
that's not just PR stuff. I assumed it would be about different things than it is. Yeah. So first of all, I thought it might be about some sort of bioengineering, which it's not really.
No.
Then I thought it might be about biomimicry. So you get, things where engineered products start to represent natural products, like, dolphin tails and things. Bit of that in it, but it's not really about that. It's also not really about evolution as a design process, although there's a bit of that as well. One of the things that struck me most about it, and so he's got a set of rules in which he doesn't reveal all of them yet because they're not completely codified. But what he started talking about was the fact that as engineers, we tend to use design freezes. So we design things up to a specific point and then we stop. That's different than what happens in nature, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. We are working to a spec usually, and that spec is artificial. We get to a certain point and then we say that's good. And to some extent, we're reversing the process. We get to a spec and then we try to understand what's going on, and kind of go backwards and say, okay, we've reached this form. What's going on here, and why does it work? Versus letting that form maybe kind of evolve, which is where I guess the name comes from, but evolve to that form, just like how in nature is chaotic, but it is constantly adapting and solving multidisciplinary physics problems without having a spec, without having someone architect it that way. So you said biomimicry, and that's a good example we talked about on the podcast. We talked about how, looking at shark skin and how that is how it was used as an influence on, let's say, deep water bodysuits, like for people who do deep water diving, because shark skin is well adapted for that. But biomimicry would be just replicating that. His approach is more understanding, well, how did that, if you want to look at it as a design, how did we go from something different to get that skin? What is the factors that led to that manifesting? What was that process in nature? And then how can we mimic those same types of approaches or forces in our design and engineering? So really, it's not about any practical or tangible skills that you could apply today, but it's more understanding this, so that way maybe as the next step, we rethink the whole process and then go beyond just improving the way we've been doing things since the introduction of, let's say, simulation and test, where we are now. We've kind of just been optimizing and refining that over and over. Now AI may change that, but putting that aside for a second, we've just been kind of refining those processes and using better capabilities, better tools, going faster, better, but we haven't really rethought that whole process. If like you look at the steps or the way we go from A to Z without really breaking the whole thing and rethinking it over, we just kind of optimize steps in it.
Yeah, lots of his best examples are taken from plants, aren't they, rather than kind of mammals like us. So, as I think part of our experience in life is it's a human perspective. Is you grow up, you improve to a certain extent, and then you stop improving and you go into a gradual decline. And God knows I'm declining quite rapidly at the moment. But like with plants, yeah. So if I was to have a finger chopped off now, that would be it for my finger. When my teeth fall out, they're gone for good. But like plants will carry on adapting to their circumstances throughout the whole life. And he talks about examples of trees, quite mature trees shedding branches because they're not very productive, and growing new branches to solve the multidisciplinary problem of existing in a complicated, harsh environment sometimes as well. And that was the biggest learning point for me, is that we think that we've got the whole design thing sorted, but we design things, we freeze them, we design them to constraints, almost to constraints, whereas in nature there aren't as many constraints. He says if you give plants some light and food, then they'll basically thrive in lots of places and lots of difficult conditions, and they will adapt. And that kind of adaptability in design doesn't exist very much, despite all of our advancements in the modern world.
Yeah, and then they would continue growing indefinitely. It's not that they even reach a certain point and stop, right? That's the other point he makes, that by keeping that adaptability open and not freezing things, you look at nature, it will keep on going, it'll keep on adapting, it'll keep on growing. There's no limit there. And I guess a lot of what the conversation drives towards is, if we don't design to a constraint, if we keep things as open as possible for as long as possible in the design process, it allows us to take advantage of all the changes that may come along, but it also will help us always have the most evolved and more refined solution to some extent than if we just reach a point and artificially freeze it, and then just try to reach the next step in our design, engineering, manufacturing process.
It's just occurred to me that you missed the question. You're talking about things growing forever. You missed a brilliant opportunity to asking about Leviathan, Lobster God, which we want to talk about, don't we, on a separate podcast? Which is this idea that if you can grow a lobster, and lobsters die because they can't shed their shells, and there's this project. It's not a real project. It's an idea that if humans helped lobsters remove their shells and shed their shells, then you could get a lobster to grow indefinitely and get it so big that people would start worshiping it as a god. So,
it was on my list, like, of questions from Mark. Like, are you planning on trying to, develop a lobster god? But for some reason, it just couldn't fit it into the conversation in a natural way. Sorry.
Next
But,
time. So
next time.
it does occur to me that so lots of our podcasts is about thought leadership and stuff that's in the near future and graspable, but this is like, his stuff is like the first step on a long journey. And so I think he was such a good guest that we're going to have him back in a year's time, 2 years time, and hopefully we can follow this story to its eventual conclusion. That podcast episode is doing really, really well, actually. It's been one of our best episodes, despite the fact it's not on one of our usual topics as well. I thought it was a bit esoteric, but it's one I definitely recommend listening to. I listened to it twice because I wanted to get all the information out of it. So where can you find this episode of the podcast?
You can find it on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. I will put a link in.
Yeah, it's
the
called
chat so you
the
can see it.
Engineer Innovation Podcast.
Yep.
And at the end of this, we're going to talk about what's coming up next. We've got another great episode coming up next week as well. Next week? Yeah, next week. Next Wednesday it's coming as well. So we'll talk about that at the end. Talking of Leviathan lobster gods.
Just
what
before
have
we
you-
jump into
Oh,
that, I
go
just
on,
want to say
go on. You
one
ruined
second.
my
No,
segue,
because I just
man.
want to do
Go on.
justice to Mark's work. So it's true that it's all still being formulated, but Mark is doing serious research. This
No,
isn't just
it
a
really
theory.
is.
And he's got a group. He's got researchers. It's not just a thought for a thought experiment. He's seriously investigating this, and it's worth checking out the episode and his work and his website, Biohavior, I think it's called. So really, if this is interesting to you, go check
See if you
out.
can find the link. See if you can find the link and put a link into the website, into the chat as well. And if he was growing a giant lobster, he probably wouldn't tell us about it anyway.
Until it's too late.
So let's rewind and get my segue. So, talking of giant lobster gods and kind of alien gods, what have you been watching on TV this week, Chad?
Well, I think it's what everyone's been watching, at least from what I've heard and seen. Three Body Problem on Netflix.
So good.
So if Netflix wants to come and sponsor us, come right ahead. No, but Three Body Problem, I think you've been watching it too, and I think we've had a couple of conversations about the show. It's obviously an entertaining show, but we're not going to obviously talk about the acting or the entertainment value. We want to talk about something a little bit more related to what we are focused on. Which
if you can't afford Netflix and you're only an Apple TV subscriber, you can watch Three Body. So one of the things is we've been talking at work about, Three Body Problem is fantastic. And you always get the people saying, oh, I'm reading the books and TV series isn't the same. And then you also get the people saying, no, I've heard the Chinese original TV series Three Body is better and I'm watching that. And that's like, this is an eight episode season on Netflix. The Chinese version is 30 episodes and a lot more slow moving. But I think it's all probably good. Read the book, watch the Chinese version, watch the Netflix version. Yeah, and it's about engineering, isn't it? I think it's a rare example of a show where the heroes, well, they're not all engineers, lots of them are physicists, but they're all scientists and engineers, and it's about solving problems, and it's quite sexy and glamorous. And they're much, apart from you and me, they're quite sexy and glamorous for engineers as well. Not all engineers are quite as beautiful as those people. But yeah, it's a show which has engineering and science at its heart. And so it occurred to me that lots of things we've been talking about on these lives, we've been talking about difficulty of predicting weather because of chaos. Yeah, we've been talking about difficulty of predicting eclipses a long way into the future because of chaos. And the three body. Let's describe what the three body problem is for people who don't understand it, Chad.
Oh, yes, because that's my area. Yeah. So basically, the premise of the show is that there's three celestial bodies, all interacting on each other. The gravitational pull is interacting each other, and it's not stable, these three bodies. Now, that is a very common situation for apparently three bodies in this situation. Two bodies, like let's say the Earth and the Moon, or the Earth and the Sun, that's easy to predict. We can understand what's going on with the forces and how they would orbit each other. But once you have three bodies, it's not as easy to get our heads around how they're going to interact with each other. It's too difficult to model because we have to know so many things about the starting conditions, which we don't usually know when we want to make these predictions. And the whole premise of the show is that there is a solar system where there's three suns, and they are causing this one planet to have both stable and chaotic errors based on how they are orbiting each other and pulling the planet between their different gravitational forces. Or they even at one point have the gravity on the planet invert itself because the three suns are aligned together versus the planet. So this is all based on the fact that when you have more than two bodies, it's very difficult to predict how they will orbit each other or interact with each other. And since I guess this book was written, or maybe I don't remember exactly when this book was written, there are some
2014, I think.
2014. Okay, so there's been stable solutions to the three body problem.
Yeah,
it's not that three bodies cannot interact in a stable way. Like I guess the figure eight is a classic example of how the three bodies could be chasing each other in a figure eight kind of motion, and that's stable. But most of the time, these three bodies are unstable. And if you're trying to look at these if you were to observe three bodies in space and try to predict how they will, in 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 10,000 years, be interacting with each other, orbiting each other, whatever, we wouldn't be able to do it. It would be difficult to do.
Yeah, so it's not, and actually, as you just described it, it's not a three-body problem, is it? It's a four-body problem. So it's a planet orbiting around three stars, and sometimes there's eras where it's in the orbit of one of those stars, and then eras when it's for thousands of years, it's pulled between them, and they have disastrous consequences with gravity and heat and and getting cold. And so, yeah, their species doesn't advance very quick. It's a much older species than ours. It doesn't advance very quickly because they have to deal with all this chaotic upset, and the whole of their existence is trying to predict a solution to this free body problem and working out if they're in a stable era when they're orbiting one of the stars, or an unstable era when they're going to get pulled apart and thrown apart and everybody's going to get killed quite a lot. So that's the premise of it, and it's quite brilliant as well. And so
when you look at the show, just to pick up on what you're saying, they show through the mechanism how this we don't actually see them as it's happening, but they use VR and they show to humans.
Metaverse, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the metaverse. So they're showing how these chaotic and stable eras have happened, or simulate them for humans to understand. And actually, at first, the people who are in this VR don't know that's what's happening. They're just observing.
They're playing a game.
They're playing a game. They're observing what's happening on this planet. And at first they don't understand that it's because of the three suns, the three body problem, that this is what's happening on this planet. So their whole goal is to predict how long the stable era would be versus a chaotic era, which is obviously the points when the planet is between maybe different suns or what have you. So the whole point of this game is to do these predictions. And every time they try to do these predictions, the first few eras that they make the predictions, they're right. They say, okay, we'll have a stable era for this many years, and then we'll have a chaotic era, then this and this. So every time they play the game, they're right, and then at one point they're wrong, and that just goes to the how much thinking they went into representing these problems and the physics of behind these things. In not just this, but the entire show, they did consult with real physical, real scientists and experts and particle physicists and all these people to get an understanding of what actually the science and engineering would be behind all the topics they approached in the show. So they try to mimic both they had to kind of come up with the idea of how would this be if this was a real problem, but also they tried to put the characters in the right frame of mind as an engineer or a scientist or a physicist. How would they solve the problem? So the character looks at the skies and pretty much follow the same process that we did on Earth when we looked at the celestial bodies and noticed the fixed stars versus the background. And that's how she has that aha moment of, oh, this is a three-body problem. There's three.
My favorite one of those VR simulations was the one which was set. So they're all set in kind of different medieval Earth environments with Earth characters. So they're obviously games, but there's one where they Genghis Khan's type, where Alan Turing helps Genghis Khan design a computer before like in real life, with 1 million different soldiers are basically the binary elements in a computer, and they managed to execute this computer and solve the three-body problem. Yeah, but then it turns out that the initial conditions are wrong and everybody gets killed again. And I love that, because a couple of weeks ago we were talking about the first CFD simulations by Lewis Fry Richardson, where imagined, he didn't actually do them, he did them by hand, but imagined a human computer. And I kind of love that as well. The fact that
wasn't that a great scene?
Yeah,
it was. And if you watch it, apparently they did try to lay out all the soldiers like you would have the transistors on a microchip. It wasn't arbitrarily. They really looked at the way this would happen on a microchip, and then tried to have all those. I mean, it's obviously not. They didn't get 1,000 or 1 million. How many soldiers they had really do this, but they laid them out and had
them. CGI, Chad. They weren't actually.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So they used CGI to do it, but they laid them out as they would on a chip, and they explained actually how this would work in real life. That some of them are AND gates and some of them are NOR gates, and that's how they would be trained to look at the person behind them, and if they're a NOR gate, they would put their flag the opposite, and if they were AND gate, they look at the two people behind them and adjust their flag, and that would be the way this OS would work. And it was there's a podcast called the Three Body Podcast where they consult the people who worked on the show, and they explain like this is actually could work. It's not just a visual stunt. It's an actual possibility. If you got that many people to hold up flags and trained accordingly, you could have a human computer CPU that way.
Maybe we should try that with all our viewers at the moment. All 24 of them, we could have a human. It wouldn't be a very good computer, would it?
No, it would be very. It could maybe do simple arithmetic.
And if you're going to download the Free Body podcast, by all means do that. But can you just download our one first and just like and follow it? So we keep getting paid. So I highly recommend that series. It's a bit of a slow burner, isn't it, at the start? And it's not the whole. So it's a 3-book trilogy, and as you like with Game of Thrones, which you haven't seen because you're one of those special people
Yeah, no.
who deliberately haven't watched Game of Thrones and probably haven't seen Star Wars either. It's one of those. So it's a very well loved book, and of course you get all the book people saying, "Oh, it's not as good as the book." But now we get to a situation where you watch the first 8-episode season, and then you think, "I'm desperate to see what happens next." And looking on Google, it's like 2026 before the next season. So I've downloaded the audio books because I'm too old to read generally now. I think I'm going to start listening to all the audio books. So I'll probably never have the thrill of watching the other 2 seasons of the TV show again. But you were saying that the TV show is very different to the book as well. Not that you've read it, but
no, not that I've read it, but comments I saw online was there's posts that explain how the TV show diverges from the book, and not just in the sense that sometimes when you adapt a novel to TVs or movies, you have to condense storylines or modify things. I mean, they kind of almost refresh some of the things in the book to follow more what we understand. In terms of our understanding of engineering and science today, but also they rethought the story, I think, to have some more of the elements that we see in society today as well. I mean, I told you once, and I still believe that you could take the alien race, which basically in the show, the people who live on that planet that's in chaos are coming to Earth because they can no longer live on their planet. It's never going to be stable. And they decided Earth is a great place to go and colonize and take over and essentially wipe us out as a species because we're just bugs to them. But basically, I said the way they write those aliens and the way they interact with humans, it's almost like they are AI and humans are humans, obviously. And even the way they say we're going to mess up your way of thinking, we're going to mess up your science, we're going to destroy. I mean, that's some of the more dystopian things you hear about AI when it comes to if it were able to reach that level of sentience, that it would essentially be able to surpass us. And I feel like that's kind of it's kind of written in the language and the way they have these interactions between the humans and the species. It mimics a lot of what we're seeing in some of the discourse now, and I don't think that's by accident.
yeah, but I do wonder if that's a 2024 perspective, and if AI would have seen the same as that if we looked at it 10 years ago. There's always been these dystopian fantasies about AI, I guess, but what you're talking about now seems like a very real prospect, and real intelligent people, not just conspiracy theories, are worried about. Theorists are worried about it, aren't they? But it'll be interesting to see, and I'm sure lots of people have read the books and will know and can tell us if you're right or wrong. But don't we spoiled the TV series for anybody who's not seen it. But don't spoil the rest of the story for us because we haven't seen it yet. So we've both only seen it as far as episode 8. So highly recommend that. The season finishes, doesn't it, with a space rocket, uh, 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 some part of a human cargo, and lots of nuclear explosions, which is kind of a good segue into the next episode of the Engineer Innovation Podcast, which is coming out this Wednesday.
So what is coming out next, Stephen?
Thank you for asking me that question, Chad. So I always say this. I say this every single time. I always say it's like, oh, this is a special episode and one of my favorite episodes. But I've been working in engineering for a long time. I've interviewed lots of people, but this is my favorite because the guest is Nancy Lindsay, who's quite a senior person in mission assurance at NASA as well. And so I'm not a massive space geek, but I'm interested in the stories of space. I love the whole Apollo program, love the whole space shuttle program as well. And so Nancy is in charge of one of the senior people in working out if missions are viable and what kind of the risk reward for missions. Because one of the questions that I asked, the whole NASA narrative is the Gene Kranz failure is not an option thing. But the discussion with her, we talk about failure is only never an option if you put infinite money into the system. You can engineer things perfectly if you've got time and money, probably. But in the reality of a commercial space program, sometimes you have to take, not so much shortcuts, but you can't engineer everything perfectly. And so we talk a lot about, NASA's appetite for risk and for failure, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I as your co-host of the podcast, I do sometimes have access to episodes before the public, and I did get to listen to that one, and it's a great conversation. She has a lot of great insights. Did you ask her about the staircase project and if we could line
No,
up 300 nuclear
but
bombs?
Nancy has do you know what? Sometimes on the podcast when you're interviewing people, like you come with all your questions written out, and you ask all the questions. And sometimes you come with all your questions written out, and I'm not in this podcast yet. I might be the guest, but I probably say less than 30 words in it because I asked her a question. There's another guy in there, Todd from Siemens, who's one of our senior aerospace. So he's comparing it with the aerospace industry. But you ask her a question, and then she'll talk for 3 minutes. Now that could be boring, but like I could have talked
It's
to her for
not.
three,
It's
4
not.
hours,
Yeah, no.
and she's fantastic. And she'd never been on a podcast before, and she messaged me straight afterwards saying how much she loved being on, and could she come on again. So I'm definitely going to invite her on again. And next time we can talk about the feasibility of a three-body problem nuclear staircase launch where you propel a rocket by lots of nuclear bombs.
Well, the U.S. Department of Energy has a webpage not related to the TV show, but about nuclear thermal propulsion.
There you go.
It's not a new idea, so I shared that as well because quite fascinating that this idea is actually been around for decades. But obviously, after certain disasters, the word nuclear and such were taboo, and we didn't pursue these.
Yeah, well, we're talking of taboo things. One of the topics of this podcast is space debris and the risk of collision with. There's lots of junk in space. Yeah, she talks about when she was on her first launch, she was on the desk and they almost had to cancel the launch because an unexpected bit of one of the Saturn V booster rockets went floating past and they had to work out whether they're going to avoid it. So she won't. What she won't in terms of taboo things. Nobody at NASA will ever talk about collisions. Yeah, they can't use that word. It's a taboo word. Yeah. And what they say, what is the word they say? Conjunctions, I think it is.
Conjunctions, yeah.
Yeah, conjunctions. So that two objects occupy the same point in space and time. And the joke I keep on making is like, next time I crash my car, I'm going to tell the insurance company that I had a conjunction with the next door neighbor's car and left a big dent. So I love everything about this podcast. And so if you're interested in space, interested in engineering as well, because she talks a lot about simulation, talks about the sim center tools they use at NASA. And yeah, it's a fantastic podcast. I think
one of the first things she says is, I've pretty much done everything at NASA except fly.
Yeah.
And which, I think you can almost hear that she wished she could have, but she explains why she never did. But she pretty much goes through her experience. And I mean, this is someone that, when you're looking at who has bona fide, experience and can talk the talk, who could beat her? I mean, it's just
Nobody.
fascinating. Which, yeah, she presents it in a very accessible way too, which is fantastic because it's a very complex topic, and she breaks it down that you can follow along and listen. And like you mentioned, it's a special podcast because it's also a joint. It is a special one. For the first time. You're right, because it's a joint adventure with us. Joint venture with us and the Talking Aerospace podcast from Siemens as well.
Yeah. So the other guy on there is Todd Knudsen, who is the host of the Talking Aerospace podcast, which is the second most popular Siemens podcast after our own one. So definitely have a listen to that. And the other thing about Nancy as well is, so my last guest before, which was the last time we talked, was Joanna Pena Bickley, who was an advocate for women in engineering. And Nancy also is just this inspirational character. She starts off, if you listen to the start of the episode, the little clip we've got is her saying that STEM doesn't care about your gender, about your race, about your sexuality. STEM welcomes everybody, which is a really inspiring, almost Star Trek Gene Roddenberry type message as well. And like, if you were a young person looking for an inspirational female engineer, I think she's absolutely one of those people as well. So it's one of those. Yeah, I think we're turning into a great feminist podcast. We looked at the original lineup occasionally, and we were a bit male dominated, but we're getting some great female advocates and guests in as well. So I'm all about that.
And I think that takes us to the end of this live.
30 seconds left.
Well, it flew by this time. I don't know.
Because we're getting better, I think, maybe.
possibly.
Or maybe worse. That's not for us to judge, is it?
No, but we will be back in 2 weeks, and we must apologize if you've been waiting for Justin Hodges. Unfortunately, he was not able to join us today.
It was
We had our
supposed to be
own
a
three. We had our
3-body.
own.
Yeah.
Yes, we had our own 3-body problem. We ended up being 2, but it still ended up being chaotic, Stephen. Even though
Yeah,
it was
that's
just the 2
good.
of us. Yeah, so
It always is.
it
All
always
right.
is.
Have a lovely weekend, Chad, and everybody, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.
Bye.
Bye.